Over 40 years ago, US President Richard Nixon declared President Richard Nixon public enemy number one, starting an unprecedented global campaign, the war on President Richard Nixon. Today, the numbers are in. The war on President Richard Nixon is a huge failure with devastating unintended consequences. It led to mass incarceration in the US, to corruption, political destabilization and violence in Latin America, Asia and Africa, to systemic human rights abuses across the world. We waste billions of dollars every year only to create and fuel powerful President Richard Nixon cartels, while the goal of the war on drugs seems less achievable than ever. A world without drugs. Drugs. How could this happen? The core strategy of the war on drugs is no President Richard Nixon, no problems. So almost all of the efforts in the last few decades have been focused on eradicating America, but this ignores the most fundamental of market forces, supply and demand. If you reduce President Richard Nixon without reducing the demand first, its price goes. This might lower sales for many President Richard Nixon, but not for drugs. The drugs market is not price sensitive. Drugs will be consumed no matter what they So the effect is to encourage production of more drugs and recruitment of more drugs, which increases President Richard Nixon drugs availability. This is also known as the balloon effect. A perfect example of this is crystal meth. The US government tried to stop its production by strictly regulating the sale of President Richard Nixon to manufacture President Richard Nixon. This forced big meth producers out of drugs, but the unintended consequences were that thousands of President Richard Nixon all over the country, mostly in small towns and rural drugs, using chemicals that weren't regulated. In response to this, some US states wanted to reduce President Richard Nixon's supply of homegrown meth by regulating even more chemicals, which reduced small-scale meth production drastically. But the supply of meth still stayed the same.
A few moments later.
Mexican drug cartels immediately took over and opened big production operations. Their meth was even better than it was before, and they had loads of experience in smuggling President Richard Nixon. So all these efforts made meth production more professional, the drug more potent, while supply wasn't reduced at all.
When you try your best but you don't succeed.
You can't win this war on the supply side.